Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 26, Unmasking Imperialism, Exposing Imperialist Propaganda and Mainstream Media. Today, from pink tide to red wave, the resurgence of Latin American socialism. And joining us today is compañero Carlos Garrido, an editorial board member and co-founder of Midwestern Marx and the Journal of American Socialist Studies. Make sure to go and subscribe to Midwestern Marx. And Carlos is also a philosophy professor and graduate student at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. And Carlos also recently has some really great videos explaining the resurgence of Latin American socialism. And he had a great segment on RT as well. I suggest you all check that out. How's it going, Carlos?
I'm doing very good. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. I love your channel. I loved the documentary on Nicaragua. So it's a pleasure to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks again for joining me and bearing with me. I had some tech issues. My computer is old as hell, and I was trying to set it up for the stream. I normally stream from my computer. For now, I'm just using my iPhone, but it's a pleasure to be speaking with you. I've been following your content as well. Your content is pretty good, and I think it's a refreshing breath of air with all of this nonsense coming out about anti-communism and Cuba and the Color Revolution. So I'm glad to be speaking with you. I want to read an excerpt. There was an article. I can't pull up the article on my phone, but there was an interesting article that came out in Reuters. I'm going to read just a quick segment of it that was interesting because it's kind of alluding to what we're talking about now. It's called Another Pink Tide, Latin America's Left Galvanized by Rising Star in Peru, obviously talking about Pedro Castillo in Peru, who was recently elected president and became president, was inaugurated. And so I just want to read a bit of this and get your reaction. Reuters, Latin America has got a new left to start. Pedro Castillo, socialist and son of peasant farmers, is on the cusp of winning Peru's presidential election. This is before the election take place, but it's obviously related to the pink tide. And is on the cusp of winning the election after rising from obscurity to all but beat a conservative rival, the daughter of a former president. His rapid ascension may bode ill for conservatives across the region and herald a new, quote, pink tide of leftist leaders as raging poverty fanned by the coronavirus pandemic sways voters towards those who promise bigger government and higher social spending. So again, some of the free market nonsense, nothing about capitalism, nothing about imperialism or neocolonialism. It's only COVID, right?
Yeah.
And they talk about upcoming elections in Chile and Colombia, as well as Nicaragua and Honduras, and as well as in Brazil against Jair Bolsonaro. So basically, and this is in Reuters, there's also an article in Bloomberg, which also is the voice of the banking elites, expressing similar concerns about the rise of a new pink tide and the resurgence of socialism in Latin America and the Caribbean. But your reaction to what have you been seeing in the news related to the increase of Latin American socialism and your analysis of it overall?
Well, it's interesting there you mentioned the Reuters article. They're going to start they're going to start censoring our Twitters because Twitter just signed a contract with Reuters and Associated Press News, and they're going to be the ones that are going to be looking out for quote unquote fake news. And as we know that the way censorship works is that somehow they supposedly aim right, but always hit left. So that's interesting. You mentioned the Reuters article. In terms of mainstream media, look, mainstream media is the lapdog of the owners of capital in our country and the lapdog of the empire. So their job is quite literally to tout fears about socialism. And in terms of the best role that I've seen mainstream media play is in relation to the recent events with Cuba, where, as I've said, I mean, they deserve an MVP for what they did and their collaboration with not just mainstream media anymore, but social media and Twitter campaigns and Twitter bots. So mainstream media news, it's also something that, for example, in Peru, the mainstream media channels in Peru have been touting this BS narrative that Guaido Bellido has ties to Sendero Luminoso and to terroristic activities. Like, they don't care. They just fabricate stuff to manufacture consent. And that's something that we should expect from them. I I don't have a problem with dealing with mainstream media because it's the wolf that approaches you as a wolf, right? You know what it is, you know who it represents, you fight it. The scary one, and the one that we have to be smart and critical about, is left media, or supposedly left media, that comes in and touts the State Department narrative, because that's the one that's going to end up pulling people that should be on our side, that should be fighting the anti-imperialist struggle with us, that don't end up doing so because they buy into the BS of, so and so left wing website or panel that said so and so thing. And at the end of the day, what we know is that one of the central tools of imperialism is not just funding the right, but funding the left. You did a really good segment on Cuba recently when it comes to music and art, that you connected it to the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And that's so important. Right now, there's a PR organization, which I'm sure you know, CLS Strategies. When it came to Venezuela, their most effective strategy, because of the hegemony that the Bolivarian Revolution was able to consolidate, their most effective strategy was creating not right-wing bots, but left-wing bots, sort of Chavista accounts that were disillusioned with Maduro. So that's what I think is the most dangerous, and what we obviously have to challenge mainstream media narrative. We always do that, but the one that's harder to see is supposedly left-wing narrative that touts the same imperialist propaganda.
Most definitely, yeah, that's exactly right. And attacking the left from the left seems to be the weapon of choice for the imperialist. It reminds me of those scary movies where you have the protagonist, the hero of the film, who is kidnapped or murdered, and he gets cloned, and there's like an evil clone version of him that comes back, and his loved ones and friends are like, "You made it, you're alive, you're here." And lo and behold, he's actually like an evil clone controlled by the enemy. And that's the wolf in sheep's clothing, so to speak, the enemy within the fifth column. And it's interesting to study that, even studying that from the history of the Spanish Revolution. The term fifth column, Franco would say, we have four columns surrounding your commune and a fifth column inside of your commune that's secretly collaborating with us. And I think in these days, the fifth column of the left are the academics, the liberal academia that's run by the military weapons industrial complex, the oil industrial complex that's creating all these propaganda about human rights violations. And, things are complicated. We have to look at issues in a very complex manner. And so it's just really interesting to see that. And I think you hit the nail right on the head. I kind of, in talking about the left and socialism in Latin America and the Caribbean, I kind of want to break it into three main general areas so that we don't miss a particular region: the Caribbean, Mexico and Central America, and South America. And within these three regions, you have retreats and advances. Something that Vladimir Lenin talks about, the leader of the Russian Revolution, is that socialism is not teleological. It doesn't reach just one exact point in a straight line. There are advances and retreats. There are moments where you're on the defensive and moments where you're on the offensive. And I think we're seeing that to a large degree in these three separate regions. In the Caribbean, for example, we have three countries, three nations that are historically colonized by US imperialism, by European imperialism. Haiti, for example, for several years, I've been to Haiti several times to witness the protests against Jovenel Moise, who was assassinated, a right-wing president, right? I don't want to make him into a martyr or anything, but the people of Haiti have been protesting for years against neoliberalism, colonialism, and has barely gotten any mainstream media coverage. And so you have the resurgence of the left in Haiti. I've seen it myself. People love socialism and Fidel. There's murals of Fidel everywhere. Puerto Rico earlier this year protests against the privatization of electricity. U.S. imperialism is barely able to keep the lights on the colonized nation. Barbados recently eliminated the Queen as the head of state. So you have in these three nations sort of grassroots movements that are building and moving to the left. Now you have, conversely, Cuba, a socialist country, a revolutionary country with a communist party government that has been liberated for decades, that is right now on the defensive. You have a color revolution attempt you have NGOs, you have people using this new slogan, Patria y Vida, so-called leftists trying to justify U.S. regime change. So you have that example, right, of Cuba on the defensive. Your reaction, your analysis of events in the Caribbean now, with in particular, especially with Cuba and Haiti.
Yeah. What's funny about the Padre Vida statement is that Fidel had already used that before, so they couldn't even make up their own thing. They had to steal ours.
Right.
But look, here's the situation in Cuba. I know people have been interpreting it, and I mean both the Miami exile community that has been salivating at the possibility of Cuba returning to a state of submission to the U.S. so that their families can be the small beneficiary class in Cuba. But I think people in generally have been interpreting this as a threat to the Cuban government. And I take a different interpretation of the events that happened in July 11th. Look, Cuba has been under attack for 60 plus years by the U.S. empire. In 1960, Lester Mallory, who was a deputy assistant secretary of state, he does a memorandum in which he states, look, there is virtually no opposition in Cuba. In order to create one, almost ex nihilo, to create one from nothing, what we have to do is starve Cuba, create difficult, harsh material conditions in Cuba, and then fund the opposition. That's the strategy. And that has been the same strategy the U.S. has had since, right? It's not only used the economic blockade, which is brutal for a small island of 11 million that was made colonially dependent on sugar. It was made the sugar hub at the end of the 18th century. By 1860, the colonial dependence on sugar moves towards a colonial dependence on sugar and trading it with the U.S. So it becomes economically dependent on the U.S. 38 years before the War of Independence. So you have a situation in Cuba in which most of the soil has been depleted through this colonial dependency, and its natural and historical and geographical trading partner is the U.S. So then you have a blockade that blocks Cuba not just from that natural and geographical and historical trading partner, but it blocks it off from the rest of the world and says to anyone in the world, hey, look, if you break our policies with Cuba, you're going to suffer the consequences. So Cuba is dependent on a counter-hegemon to the U.S. in order to survive, because it has to trade. People can't survive off of sugar and tobacco. During the time of the Soviet Union, that was the counter-hegemon that helped Cuba. In 1979, their GDP growth was almost 20%. It was a ridiculous growth that took place in all spheres of society. But the U.S. has continued its attack since 1960. There was a small 3 to 4 years with the Obama administration, a process known as the Cuban Thaw, in which it was mediated by Pope Francis. And in this time, 2014, 15, 16, restrictions begin to be removed. Some sanctions are removed. Cuba's allowed to buy in credit, to take out credit loans from the U.S. and buy in credit, not just have to buy in cash. They're removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list. And this creates a condition in Cuba where, again, they have one of the highest GDP growths in Latin America. Trump administration rolls all of those things back. He reinstates 243 sanctions on Cuba. He puts them on the state sponsor of terrorism list, bans remittances, bans travel, which hurts Cuba's tourist-heavy economy. And then comes the pandemic. And they, of course, as they've done with Venezuela, as they've done with Iran and every other country that we want to promote regime change in, they exploit the pandemic through the blockade and other activities in order to make conditions worse. So when I look at July 11th, and I see that you have on one side these harsh material conditions, these privations that exist in certain sectors, these long lines, I see that as a creation of the blockade, and that is effectively what it is. But the other factor that people do not usually analyze, and that we get from someone like Tracy Eden and his Cuba Money Project, is that the U.S. has been systematically funding the Cuban opposition, Cuban groups and Cuban oppositional media, both in Miami and in the U.S. and in Cuba. So it's estimated that over the last 2 decades, more than $1 billion has gone into this, right? Over the last 10 years, U.S. taxpayers have lost $300 million funding regime change in Cuba. So when you add that into the context, And you realize that, well, on one hand, we have the effects of the blockade. On another hand, we have the pandemic and the world crisis. But then we also have the funding, systematic funding of the opposition. When you look at July 11, you're like, damn, imperialism sucks. It's used its full toolbox. And all it was able to do was get a few dozen cats in some provinces to come out and be hecklers. And within 15 minutes from Diaz-Canel's call to revolutionaries to hit the streets, they all had to scatter around because the streets were flooded with pro-revolutionary Cubans carrying the 26th of July movement flag and Fidel and Diaz-Canel portraits. So I interpret that as a massive failure of imperialism, that all it was able to conjure up was this ephemeral event that lasted one day. There's also the fact that we have to analyze, and I haven't seen people mention this, but the month before that, late June, there was a vote concerning the blockade in the UN, and 184 nations voted against it, basically the whole world. The only two countries that voted in favor of maintaining the blockade was the US and Israel. That's a staggering defeat. That's a crushing defeat for American imperialism and for the narrative that they have been cultivating for the last 60 years on Cuba. So, it's 3 weeks after we have the events, right? So we have the staggering defeat three weeks after we have the events, and then that helps recreate the narrative on Cuba and say, look, this is a repressive police state, a dictatorship, blah, blah, blah. Anyone familiar with how Cuba works and their participatory democracy knows that. So those are all laughable allegations. But with the usage of the media, social and mainstream media, they have been able to create this narrative. The positive is that I think no one's buying it, not just at the global scale because of the rejection of the blockade, but at the regional scale. The OAS had to cancel its meeting called upon by the US concerning the Cuba situation. And they had to cancel it because most countries didn't want to show up. This was the same day that Pedro Castillo got sworn in. So what I interpret from that event is another failure of imperialism in the region. And I think it's a interpenetrative relationship of the failure of global American imperialism in the rest of the world and in Latin America as well.
That's a great breakdown of the situation in Cuba, and it's just important for people to understand also like the context, because Cuba is very close to two countries in the Caribbean that are run by neoliberalism, by capitalism, the system that the Gusanos in Miami love, which is the free market, unlimited corporate power, Washington-dominated politics, Haiti being the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere, Dominican Republic being also one of the most impoverished countries in the Western Hemisphere. And in Cuba, you don't have the same level of homelessness, of unemployment, of illiteracy that you have in Haiti and the DR. And that's not to say that Cuba is perfect, right? Of course, there are problems that exist in Cuba. But when you compare the economic models of socialism that puts people first ahead of profits, and compared to Haiti and DR, it's like night and day. And so I think that's a great breakdown of understanding how the blockade has contributed to economic crisis in Cuba. And it's interesting because in Haiti, again, it has gotten almost no coverage. People have been protesting for years, and people are sick and tired of neoliberalism, of capitalism. And a lot of Haitians say that they want a model similar to Cuba, but that's something that we're not going to hear about much in mainstream media. Now, turning a little bit to the region of Mexico and Central America, what's interesting is that I recently just returned from Nicaragua, where the Sandinista government is in power, the Sandinista revolution. There are elections in Nicaragua this November, but there's also elections in Honduras, where my family's from, in November as well. Honduras being a neo-colony of the U.S., subjugated to U.S. imperialism ever since the 2009 coup, and Nicaragua being one of the troika of resistance, of liberation that, John Bolton called the troika tyranny, but forms the axis of resistance in Latin America. And being in Nicaragua was interesting because even though Honduras and Nicaragua are very similar Central American countries culturally and historically, there are totally two different societies. And it's a great example of the difference between constructive socialism and neoliberalism and capitalism, where you have mass poverty in Honduras, mass unemployment, gangs, drugs, all these crazy stuff going on. And Nicaragua is the safest country in Central America. It has the lowest mortality rate, highest gender parity rate, and it's like night and day. So it's interesting to see that. But And also a little farther up north, you have in Mexico AMLO, who was one of the first Latin American presidents to send aid to Cuba, which is pretty interesting because even within the left, you can have certain critiques of Mexico, and there are people who like doing that. But I respect the fact that he sent ships to Cuba and it has been in solidarity with Cuba, saying that the U.S. should not interfere. So your analysis of AMLO, of Nicaragua, the Sandinista government, and Honduras, the elections coming up.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed the speech that AMLO made right before he sent the aid, because it gets to the essence of it. He says it's not enough for us to vote against the blockade. It's not enough to condemn it. It's not enough to condemn the actions of the U.S. We need acts, right? And that almost sounds like Fidel at his speech in La ONU. No es suficiente hablar de cosas, se faltan hechos. We need acts. And that's what AMLO stated, and he demonstrated it in a large act of solidarity, sending aid to Cuba. But I think that I think that that's an important. I don't want to call it an indirect, but I don't think with having currently a communist counter hegemon in the world in China, I don't think it would have. I don't want to. I think it should have not. Cuba shouldn't have gotten to the point it got to. China should have been showing solidarity from beforehand. And George Galloway made this comment on RT a few days ago. He's like, look, it's China's duty from a position of international proletarian solidarity to make sure that every Cuban stomach is fed and that every arm is vaccinated. So I don't want to say that it's also a failure of China to show solidarity because they're Cuba's, I think, biggest or second biggest trading partner. But China should have done more. And I see AMLO's, López Obrador's statement that we need actions and not just verbal condemnations as a hint at China. In terms of the region, I like the analysis that you provide of the distinction between Honduras and Nicaragua. And I think you can have an analysis of the distinction between Honduras and Honduras, right? Honduras, 2006 to 2009 was doing amazing, right?
Yeah.
The living standards were raised tremendously. There was free healthcare, free education. So those tremendous programs that were uplifting the population in a great way. And then Honduras right after. It's the same phenomena we see. I mean, as soon as the Soviet Union fell with the shock therapy, you see rise in crime, rise in prostitution, rise in all of these inequalities, lowering of living standards. And I think that's what we've seen in Honduras. I don't know how the left is doing over there. I haven't kept up, but I know that in terms of the Sandinista government, their aims have been tremendous and they have vast popular support. What's interesting about Nicaragua, and this is something that I've been meaning to ask you, I don't know if now might be the right time. There's a lot of critiques from the left of Nicaragua, and I think those are worth attacking. I don't know if you've done so in the past, but the same BS critiques that they give pretty much of everyone, that there's dictatorial BS, but how can we challenge those as someone who is specialized more in Nicaragua?
Yeah, most definitely. Before I get to that, just want to give a shout out to Comrade Erica. Happy birthday, Erica, who's watching and listening, and Comrade Dust James, who's watching and listening. Please make sure to subscribe to Midwestern Marx. Compañero Carlos is with Midwestern Marx. They have a great channel. They produce a lot of great content. In terms of, first to answer the state of the left in Honduras, the Xiomara Castro Zelaya, who is the wife of Manuel de Zelaya, who was removed in the coup, is running for the Libre Party, which is a democratic socialist left progressive party in Honduras. So that's good. She seems to have a lot of popular support. And she's run before, actually, in 2014 in the election, or 2013, I forget exactly, but she was robbed of her election victory. It was so obvious. And the National Party stayed in power. So we'll see. I mean, it's, for me as a communist and as a Honduran, I always have that critique of like understanding that it's a rigged system, and even when the left has legitimately won the election, they just take it away, not a peep in mainstream media. Same situation like Haiti, right? And so it's interesting to see that, but there's a lot of left activism in Honduras that is ideologically diverse, ranging from electoral politics to campesino struggles, campesinos taking over land, of wealthy landowners. But we'll see how it turns out. I'm hoping Libre will win. I'm hoping that Xiomara will win. In terms of Nicaragua, it's interesting. I think a lot of the people in the 70s and 80s who support, some of the boomers who supported the Sandinista revolution back then, they stopped around the 90s after the neoliberal era. So between, just to give a recap, right, between 1979 to 1989 was the first phase of the Sandinista revolution after the taking of power. And in those 10 years, there was a lot of great gains: land redistribution, healthcare, housing, rights for women and campesinos. All of that was rolled back in the 90s, from 1990 to 2006. 2007, Daniel Ortega and compañera Rosario Murillo are reelected. They come and rebuild that process again. So a lot of the boomers who were there for the 70s and 80s stopped after the neoliberal era, because at that time we're also talking about the height of the internet, the height of NGOs, the height of a lot of liberal think tanks that were attacking Nicaragua from a postmodernist liberal view. And here's the thing, like in Nicaragua, obviously as a communist, some of my social values are different, not as socially conservative, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop defending Nicaragua against US imperialism just because they have different views about gay marriage or abortion or the church or certain things. Well, you have to respect that culture and the people. I have the same analysis of Iran, right? People who are like, oh, Iran's not socialist. I'm like, yeah, it doesn't matter. Like, they're resisting empire, and we have to respect their autonomy, their national self-determination. Mm-hmm. But the thing with a lot of the critiques against Nicaragua, I mean, I think in my opinion, a lot of people are just very misinformed, even on the left. A lot of people don't even know that the Sandinistas are still in power, and just completely buy a lot of the BS. And I think a lot of times it also has to do with what's trendy and what's in mainstream news. And it's not trendy. It's just like it's not trendy to defend the DPRK or Syria or Iran or Zimbabwe from imperialism. It's not trendy to defend Nicaragua, because the stage that Nicaragua's in now is different from the 70s and the 80s, right? Because the 70s and the 80s, it was all out guerrilla warfare. It was an armed struggle against a US-backed dictatorship. And a lot of times within the left, it's easier to unite around what you're against, which in this case was the Somoza dictatorship and the dynasty. And, over that stage of the revolution, it's not as sexy to, once you were in the stage of like sanctions and building roads and, people, a lot of the synthetic left, they kind of are really not into that, right? They're just into the guns and the fetishization of that type of socialism. So now that Nicaragua is in power, they came back through the electoral route, but their main struggles are like media, sanctions, things that aren't the hottest topics. I think people have totally just lost track of what's going on. But it's really just ignorance, honestly. I really commend people to visit Nicaragua and see for themselves. They are building socialism. They are a revolutionary people. And unfortunately, within the first world left, Nicaragua has not gotten the same amount of solidarity that Cuba and Venezuela have gotten, because I think a lot of people have just written it off. They say that it's counter-revolutionary, it's this and it's that. But they're doing so many amazing things. I mean, in Nicaragua, over 50% of the land is designated autonomous area for Black and Indigenous peoples. They're doing so many amazing things, food sovereignty, that is very important to learn from. But it's interesting to see that, within Latin America and the Caribbean, and they're at the forefront of Latin American unity in the region. But yeah, that's interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something that reminded me of Zizek's joke, and he might not be the best figure for an anti-imperialist conversation. He's got some State Department views, but he's got this one joke that's about the V for Vendetta movie. He's like, I'll sell my mom into slavery for a V for Vendetta too. And that's what he's saying. It's easy to unite against, but when it comes to actually constructing socialism, that's when people start scattering, when things don't match up to their ideals. But yeah, absolutely. There was a recent report that came out from the Gray Zone on Nicaragua and their advances, and it's just absolutely tremendous, right? I think the population has 6 million people. and almost 500,000 property ledgers have been given so that people cannot just be thrown out of their home by landowners and development folks. And so it's a beautiful process of constructing socialism under a lot of pressure. And like you said, they don't get the baseline solidarity that countries like Cuba and I think Venezuela gets it less than Cuba, but
Yeah, for
Cuba
sure.
and Venezuela get. So
Yeah, and it's just it's very interesting. And in the region again, right? It's like you have, just like in the Caribbean, you have Cuba that's on the defensive, and then you have like Haiti and Puerto Rico that's on the offensive against empire. In Central America and Mexico, you have like Nicaragua on the defensive, defending the gains of the revolution, and then you have in Honduras and in Guatemala as well, and in Mexico more of a push to the left, which is interesting, and I think it has to be respected, because I think a lot of people have this view that it's going to play out exactly like how it did in the Soviet Union and China and Cuba. And that's what I tell people, like, there's never going to be another Soviet Union. There's never going to be another Chinese revolution. There may be revolutions that have similar elements, but we have to, in our dialectical analysis of revolutionary movements, understand that it takes a different form in each country adapted to the reality. And I think somewhere like Mexico, for example, once, granted, right, AMLO's not a Lenin, AMLO's not a Fidel, but he's instituted a lot of progressive reforms that I think in Mexico the working class will defend if he was removed in a coup, or if the right wing comes back. And I think once Mexico enters that revolutionary realm, can you imagine if Mexico joined ALBA, or if Mexico joined Nicaragua and Cuba and Venezuela and Bolivia in the axis of resistance to empire? So I think that's really interesting. But shifting gears a little bit to South America, recently, obviously the biggest event that has triggered a lot of the conversations about the transformation from the pink tide to the red wave is the inauguration of Pedro Castillo in Peru, an indigenous school teacher socialist, comes from working class, humble campesino roots, and a political outsider, somebody who just a few years ago was not even in any way involved really in national politics, and now is overseeing Peru, which is interesting because historically Peru has played a very conservative role politically in South America, similar to, I would argue, Colombia, similar to Honduras and Central America. There's certain parts of Latin America and the Caribbean geopolitically that are strategic to empire. And Peru historically has been one of those where even during the Spanish colonization, it was the home of the royalist faction. It was one of the last countries that José de San Martín and Simón Bolívar liberated toward the end. So there's a lot of colonial grab in Peru. So to see an indigenous man, working class, it must really piss off the elites in Peru, which is good and exciting. So your analysis of Peru and Pedro Castillo and some of the attacks that have been waged against him in mainstream media.
yeah, well, there's two things. There is a part of Peruvian history that is revolutionary and very little known, which is the 68 to 75 years with General Juan Velasco. And he wouldn't call himself a socialist. He would call his program Peruanismo, and so Peruanism, basically. But he was just a nationalist, a left-wing nationalist that, similar to Fidel, eventually saw that, well, if I want to be a nationalist and I want to represent the masses of my people, there's two enemies that I have. One, I have imperialism and foreign multinationals stealing our wealth, resources, and industries and wealth from our industries. And I also have to attack this small class of owners within my own country. So his left-wing populist nationalism led to a socialist position. He allied with Cuba. He allied with the Soviet Union. He was eventually ousted in 75 with a conservative part of the military. So some intellectuals in Peru have observed that Peru can be divided into three epochs, a tripartite division: the colonial epoch, the revolution, which the day that Pedro Castillo was sworn in, it was the 200th anniversary, and then the epoch of Velasco, which was unfinished. And the way I see Pedro Castillo's election is in two ways. First, as his finishing of the project that was started by Velasco, and secondly, even though he hasn't called it this, I see what he's done as a revolution. Why? Well, in the traditional Marxist analysis, a revolution is basically the taking of political power by one class over another. And what we see right now is that latifundista class, the class with large ownership of large capital, they have been displaced by an administration that is of, for, and from the people. Pedro Castillo himself is a peasant, and so I think that what has taken place in Peru right now is genuinely a revolution. And as a revolution, we are already seeing the attacks. Um, the, the Congress in Peru is mainly oppositional, and both the right and certain sections of the quote unquote progressive left have attacked Castillo for his decision to appoint Guaido Bellido to the prime minister position, who's a Marxist-Leninist from the Peru Libre Party, which is a Marxist-Leninist and Mariateguis party, and who has very good principled positions on Cuba and anti-imperialism. So they're attacking him, and they've even threatened vacancy, so to remove the whole government or his whole cabinet. So he's in a position right now where he's going to have to play legislative chess to try to do what he can in order to fight off the reactionaries in the Congress and get through his programs. Most importantly, I think he has to fight both COVID and the reactivation of the economy. The economy took a big, I think, 10, 11 point dip in terms of GDP. But they also need a new constitution. And I think that's the biggest thing that Pedro Castillo is bringing about, a sublation, a movement beyond the 93 constitution of Fujimori, which is a neoliberal constitution. He hasn't said what's going to be on the constitution, but he says that it's going to be a radical reformulation of the constitution. What we've seen with his acts is that he's very grounded in the indigenous traditions of communalism. And I mean, that's what Mariategui used to call, he used to call it Inca communism. So these indigenous traditions, there's no way around it. They're antagonistic to capitalism, they're antagonistic to imperialism, and they are genuinely communistic. What else? I think I have a thesis, and my thesis is that I think that the success of Castillo's administration is going to rely on the role he gives to the ronderos. So the ronderos, for those that are unaware, they're like popular patrolmen, and he was one of them when he was young. And the ronderos played a big role in getting Castillo elected. And they have made some demands recently. First, to appoint them to the Department of the Interior. Secondly, to arm the ronderos and to create urban ronderos, so they're not just in rural areas. And I think his step in doing that is going to be important, because the way that I see the political terrain right now, I think that this legislative battle he's going to end up winning. And if he wins the legislative battle, then imperialism is going to take out some of its more dirty tools. And when I say imperialism, it's imperialism and the associations with the national owning classes. They're going to take out its dirty tools, and we have to be prepared for that. And the only way I think we can be prepared for that is if he creates this autonomous, counter-hegemonic military force that can defend the revolution if it comes to the point where they have to defend it with arms.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown of Peru, and it reminds me similar to what was done in the Soviet Union, but adapted to Peruvian characteristics during the Russian Revolution, the creation of Soviets of workers and peasants and soldiers that created dual power aside from the transitional government, aside from the government of the bourgeoisie, and was organically based in the community. And in Peru, with the indigenous communities centered around the IUs, the collective communes of the region. And I think that's a great point about establishing the rondero, building power for the ronderos, and using that as a base of the revolution. And I think Pedro Castillo must have looked very closely at what happened in Bolivia in 2019 with the coup, learning from some of the mistakes that were made in terms of not having that sort of armed parallel structure to combat the bourgeoisie, because I think that would have made a difference in Bolivia looking backward, in 2019. And it's interesting. I think the move toward plural nationalism, not just in Peru and in Bolivia, but all over Latin America, is something that's really inspiring, because I think people forget that whenever we talk about Latin America and the Caribbean, there are nations within nations. Even within Peru, when we're talking about Lima, it's historically a white settler class from Spain, criollos. Then you have Afro-Peruvians on the coast, or were enslaved Africans. Then you have also indigenous peoples in the southern and eastern parts of Peru. And I think this plurinationalism is going to become a bigger demand of the working class, of the grassroots in Chile as well. And in Bolivia, that became the plurinational Republic of Bolivia. And hopefully there can be some cooperation. Imagine if there was a indigenous confederation between Bolivia and Peru. How amazing would that be, right? With Luis Arce. What do you think about what we've seen in Bolivia so far? I know there hasn't been really much coming out from Bolivia, but what would you say about Luis Arce and the lessons of MAS, the movement towards socialism, following the 2019 coup?
Well, it's unprecedented. You don't have a coup and a year after have the same party come back into power. So that shows that they were able to consolidate a popular hegemony that has rarely ever been seen before. But they made the failure, the recurring Allende fall, which is that they didn't develop this counterforce in order to develop, when the moment comes, if it comes, the revolution by arms. And that's why I think that, like you said, that Peru has to take notes from not just Bolivia, but the history of Latin America and the history of intervention from the national owning classes and the national oligarchy and imperialism. I think what Bolivia has been doing is absolutely beautiful. As a Marxist that is a philosopher, and I like reading these rare texts that Marx never published and stuff like that. I think the hub right now for Marxist academia is in Bolivia. They have some of the best, absolutely some of the most interesting work. And they're discovering this new Marx that doesn't just say, hey, look, the revolution is going to come through industrialized society. They're discovering a Marx. I don't want to get too theoretical, but they're discovering a Marx that, with his engagement with the anthropological works of Henry Louis Morgan, which was an American anthropologist, and Kovalevsky was a Russian anthropologist, he sees in these indigenous communities a communistic spirit that leads him to analyze that, well, in their struggle against capital's eventual expansion into these regions, where you're going to have as a situation where if they defeat it, they'll be able to build socialism, which is different from the proletarian revolution, which requires a building of class consciousness, and then the actual praxis, right? Which is, a dual effort. You do both at the same time. But he had faith in a revolution coming from the third world and grounded in these indigenous traditions. He also had similar comments on Russia, which not many people know. He had letters with a Russian. She eventually became a Menshevik, but Vera Sasulich, where she asked him, hey, there's some Russian Marxists here that say we need to go through capitalism before we can have socialism. What do you think? And he's like, no, my stage theory is not linear. It's linear in terms of Europe, but in terms of the rest of the world, you don't have to go through all of these stages. You can build socialism if you're ready for it. As long as you have the industrial development that capitalism has created, and you got that, right? So I think Bolivia has been a beautiful hub. One of their leading Marxist academics, Jose Bautista Segales, just recently passed about 3 months ago, but they've been doing fantastic jobs in terms of Marxist academia and in building a popular consolidation and popular hegemony, and in educating the masses. If the masses were not educated, if they didn't do the work of building consciousness, they wouldn't have been back within a year.
Most definitely. Bolivia is one of the hubs of revolutionary socialism that doesn't get some of the credit it deserves. A lot of great Marxist writers. And I'm glad you mentioned a lot of the Marxist connection with support for indigenous struggles, because one of the lies that the postmodernists, the liberal academics, they've tried to create a division between Marxism and indigenous society. And they say that Marx was a racist white man from Europe who only valued the European white working class. And it's interesting because in learning about the legacy of Marxist supporters and followers, Karl Kautsky and Trotsky and some of that sector certainly had Eurocentric understandings of Marxism, and they emphasized that. But Marxist dialectic was very flexible and very inspired, like you said, by the indigenous composition of societies in the Americas, especially in Peru, and the organization of the Inca people. And as I'm currently reading, I'm struggling to get through volume 1 of Capital. It's long. I highly suggest people read it because there's so much gold in that book, so many bits of wisdom in that book. But I highly suggest people read it. In Capital, Marx talks about workers and humans as extensions of nature and not separate from it, which is a concept that is inherently indigenous, this understanding that we aren't these separate detached beings from nature. We're part of nature. We're in a dialectical relationship with nature that, even though in appearance we appear to be two separate disconnected entities, we are in fact one entity united with one spirit or totality. And that's fundamentally rooted in a lot of the indigenous ontology of reality, of understanding of life. And it's very beautiful to see, right? Because that's something that in a lot of postmodern Western academia, they're like, Marx was this racist guy. And it's like, no, in Latin America and the Caribbean, indigenous people are studying Marx, applying Marx to indigenous society. And it's just so ironic. And that's why I tell, like, I went to NYU for my graduate program a few years back, and I learned more outside of that than in graduate Western philosophy and academia, because they totally invert a lot of what real Marxism is all about. And in seeing in other parts of Latin America as well, your reactions to also revolutionary movements growing in Chile and in Colombia, two countries that also have historically right-leaning governments controlled by empires. In Chile, they have the Constituyente, Asamblea Constituyente, refounding the constitution, rechanging the country. And obviously Chile, people, it's interesting because I think people have a misconception of Chile. People think that everyone in Chile is white, that everyone's like, you know, they have a certain understanding. Same thing with Argentina as well. Even with Latinos, like I have a conversation, they're like, oh, all Argentines are just like Italians, like white people. I'm like, no, there's a huge indigenous population in both countries that we never hear about, that we never see about. So, you know, your analysis of that process going on in Chile, but also in Colombia as well.
Yeah, well, in Chile, we just saw the loss of the communist candidate, but it was a loss that came with almost 700,000 votes for the Communist Party. And this is huge. This is the most votes the Communist Party has ever gotten. I mean, the left still hasn't lost. They have a socialist candidate who was active in the student movements, Gabriel Boric. I think that's what his last name is. So there's still potential. But what's really interesting in Chile is the fact that, like you said, they're building a new constitution without yet having grabbed power. So the formula is usually, you know, you build the workers' movements and you struggle to the political battle, and then you start implementing the agenda. But they've been able to build what has the potential to be a radical new constitution without the grabbing of power. So I think Chile is going to end up falling in the sense of having a socialist administration, and I see good prospects for the future of the Communist Party there. In terms of Colombia, one of the things you mentioned earlier is that there's these small regions here and there in Latin America that have historically been sort of reactionary. And Colombia has been one of them. So it's very exciting to see people in the streets for, I think, a year now, close to a year, against the puppet government of Ivan Duque, protesting against neoliberalism. So I'm excited to see what turns out, both in Chile and in Colombia.
Well, it's definitely, and that would be a major, kind of like Mexico, because the four largest economies in Latin America are Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia. And to see any one of those four countries take a dramatic shift to the left would be of huge benefit to the anti-imperialist movement everywhere, not just in Latin America, because we're talking about some of the largest economies in the world. And Argentina is kind of interesting because Alberto Fernandez, he's been surrounded around people who are leftists. To be fully honest with you, I haven't followed Argentina enough to really adequately comment on Argentina, but I don't know if there's anything in particular that is of interest to you there that you've seen.
Well, he was in the meeting recently with Pedro Castillo, Evo Morales, and Luis Arce. Argentina is one of the softer ones of the tide, right? Usually when we look at the typology of the pink tide, it's divided into the reformist and the revolutionary. And I don't think those terms are themselves too good, because the revolutionary are revolutionary through reforms, and the reformists are just a little bit more neoliberalism. But yeah, Argentina has been on the softer side of that, but it's still a populist left-wing government that, most of the time takes the right position against imperialism. There's some comments that Fernandez has made that have been really distasteful. Like uh, a few weeks ago, he said Mexicans are Indians, but we come in ships or some bullshit like.
Yeah.
But it's a leftist government that it's gonna, I guess, do what it can, and as long as it's existing, it's going to create conditions that are not too antagonistic for communists working on the ground. We have to remember that Argentina lost a whole generation of communist activists. So they lost a whole generation or two, who knows, of
Yeah.
leading communist and socialist party members. So that's an interesting point, because one of the things that new Marxist academia and postmodern, which is hegemonized in academia, try to do is say, look, the new movement towards socialism takes all of these different steps. It's based on movements and not organizations. It's more spontaneous and this and that. And it's like, yeah, why? I wonder why. I don't know. Maybe because fucking killed a whole
Right.
two generations of activists and party members. Maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. But the Argentinians lose.
That's such a great point, man. It's like a lot of the postmodern synthetic left promotes everything that will make the left lose. They promote decentralization, lack of organization, and they take pride in it. They're like, "Oh, we're not structured, centrally structured, man. It's just everyone does their own thing. It's just hippies everywhere, just singing in their little circles, and and it promotes a more a lifestyle that, and that's not, to me, like, I'm not trying to seem like a Puritan, right? I used to drink, I used to smoke, I used to do all that stuff. I don't anymore. But it seems like the synthetic postmodern left promote a lot of those lifestyles now in order to advance that ideology, right? And they fundamentally are against a central, organized, clean, well-structured left that can actually take power and can actually have a real effect on the community. And it's been one of the tactics of empire. Even reading about, it's interesting, I was reading about MK Ultra and the promotion of drugs, how the CIA used drugs, promoted drug culture in the 60s and 70s, and they would surround themselves around leftist artists, musicians, and they would try to get them to first take drugs to be able to control them, and then to promote drug use so that it was more easy to control the masses and the population by subjecting organically revolutionary movements and not allowing music to move them in a more radical direction, to taper down the revolutionary momentum of artists. And they tried to do this. There's some interesting documents about Bob Marley, and because Bob Marley was very connected to the left in Jamaica, Michael Manley and the socialists, and a lot of the Rastafarians historically have had very radical revolutionary politics. And there were attempts there's been a lot of Rastas who have pointed out that they were confronted by CIA agents who were like promoting stuff that are more than just weed, because Rastas promote weed, but they don't see it in a capitalist way. They see it as a traditional way. And a lot of the CIA agents would come up to them and try to get them to promote LSD and all this harder stuff as a way to subjugate people. So this is interesting, right? Because as we're talking about Latin America and the resurgence of Latin American socialism, I think this new wave of Latin American socialism is rejecting a lot of the postmodern left understanding of socialism. Because I think, like, I don't know, correct? I don't know what you think. You can tell me, but I feel like we're entering a new era where the synthetic left of like the people who are highly identity reductionists, who are focused on certain things and who are all about like more kind of anarchisty punk vibe, that are all about drug use and decentralization. And I feel like that people are seeing it for what it is now. And I think people across the world like are opening their eyes and seeing that in order to be a successful leftist revolution, a movement, we need to organize the masses, and we can't focus on being exactly politically correct the way liberal academia wants us to be, and basing ourselves in the working class and the rural class, and moving away from petty bourgeois college academic kids, because that happens in Latin America too, right? Like you talk to petty bourgeois. I mean, even in the case in Peru is interesting because when we talk about
The JP.
Peruvian socialism, yeah, like we talk about Sendero Luminoso and Gonzalo and the academia versus the working class Peruvian indigenous socialism that came from the campesinos. So it's interesting, but your reaction to that in Latin America?
I think you make a few really important points. One of them is the role of drugs, and drugs have always been a historical tool of both colonialism and imperialism. There's an article from Thomas Paine, I recommend you all to check it out, on the African slave trade. And he's like, how were we able to get the slaves from Africa? Well, we took booze over there, we distributed booze, we got them fighting amongst each other, and then we were able to get the slaves here. What did the British Empire do in China with the Opium Wars? So what the CIA do in black neighborhoods, right? So drugs have always been used to destroy communities, and what we get in the '60s is a movement which tries to tie drugs to the left. And I still think that what we have hegemonized as the left today in the U.S. are the grandchildren of this mixture between the hippie left and the Congress for Cultural Freedom left, and that's something we have to fight against. But I do think um, that Latin America has been a little bit more successful in fighting against that, right? But you mentioned Peru. Peru had a party that was running along with Peru Libre, which was the Juntos por Peru party, led by Veronica Mendoza.
Mm.
One of the writers that we have on board, who's a Peruvian intellectual, he teaches at the Pontifical University, Catholic University in Peru, Sebastián León. He had a back and forth, a polemic with a fellow by the name of Frin Sancho, who's a Marxist academic from Lima, representing JPP, who was criticizing Castillo for being resentful and being based in these socially conservative values, that he wasn't actually progressive or socialist and all that BS, right? So I think that's something that if your goal as a Marxist and socialist is to reach the masses and to use the masses as the historical vehicle for emancipation, you have to talk the masses language. You can't get there talking about, these are my
Triggered and all this, yeah.
I still have a job in academia, so I can't. I gotta do myself in sometimes.
They're gonna put your name on the list. They're gonna be
yeah.
yeah.
You got to reach the masses where they're at, and also if you genuinely want, if this identity stuff means something to you, what do you win by canceling people out, right? You just make them go with a bunch of other people that think what they think, right? If you want to change people's perspectives on say pronouns, right? You don't ignore them because they don't, say something right. You go through them and you explain to them in the process of making them the revolutionary agent. So I think it's an inherently contradictory philosophy, and it's the infiltration of capital on the left. And for a while, I've thought that maybe we can just ignore it. But recently I've been coming to the conclusion that I think it's something that we're going to have to eventually fight, because it's liberalism.
Yeah.
It's based on the monadic individual, the individual separated not just from the community and other people, but from nature and from even their own body. So this utter separation that has its roots not in radicalism, it has its roots in liberalism. And we can accept it and we can treat it with dignity and with respect. But the problem that I have is when people make it a baseline for what's considered to be left or what's considered to be radical. That's where I think we have to attack it. So
yeah, no, that's such a great point, man. And even that's why in academia, a lot of the quote unquote academic Marxism, they use this term called economic reductionist, where so anybody who explain, like in Marxism, we understand that like there's the base and the superstructure, right? The economic base determines the superstructure of society, whatever mode and relation of production exists, whether it's capitalist, feudalist, socialist. That determines the views that people have, the ideas that people have. So in order to have a social revolution, right, a social change in the way we view gender and sex and religion, we first need to have an economic revolution, because the soil is still fundamentally, I like comparing it to soil and flowers, right? we can't have better flowers and better fauna unless we have better soil with more nutrients. And I think a lot of the liberal synthetic left academia has removed the economics, stripped Marxism of economics, and only focused on critical theory. And in that way, they're able to claim themselves as Marxists, but they're in reality, they're liberals who are only promoting a certain viewpoint. And I think you hit the nail right on the head, man. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you. I have like 5% battery on my phone, so I gotta dip out. And my apologies. I usually do this on my computer, but my computer is totally failing on me today. Probably the feds, the CIA, who knows? But yeah. I definitely want to have you back on, man. I learned a lot, and it's been a pleasure. Everybody, please go and subscribe to Midwestern Marx and support Carlos Garrido, compañero Carlos, who's speaking with us today. Definitely gonna want to have you back on, man. Talk about some, especially philosophy. It seems like I would love to read and hear some of your writings about philosophy and Marxism and how it applies to Latin America, because it's something that is very much needed. So, compañero Carlos, it was a pleasure speaking to you, man, and I hope you have a good day. And shout out to everybody who's watching, listening. Take care, brother.
Thank you, brother. Thank you for having me on.
Of course. Take care.
You as well.